it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink and listen. In tonight's unsettling tale, the quiet rural town of Haversham seems like the last place to harbor a secret. Trevor Milton, a bright teenager determined to put his hometown on the digital map, takes it upon himself to document its long history, beginning with the town's aging cemetery. What starts as a simple project to preserve the past soon turns into something far darker. As Trevor digs deeper into the graves and records, he uncovers disturbing patterns and hints of something hidden beneath Havsham that was never meant to be found. Haversham Redacted by E.B. Davis. There are seemingly countless sleepy little towns in rural America, practically invisible to all but the few hundred who call each of these towns home. Only 100 years ago or so, Americans used to live in these little villages, making a living as farmers. Society has changed so much and so fast that it's easy to forget that these towns exist. Unless perhaps if you're in an airplane flying at night, looking down at the window at tiny little clusters of lights, or perhaps randomly trawling through Google Earth in the idle chance that you might find something interesting. Haversham is one of those towns that's practically invisible. I won't mention which state it's in. Some of these towns should be forgotten, and Haversham is one of them. When it comes to the scenery, Haversham ranks among the best. It's nestled in a region of great natural beauty, though it's subtle instead of dramatic. It's ideal and idyllic farmland. It's the sort of region where photographers come to make postcards or maybe famous computer desktop backgrounds. There are countless rolling, gentle hills. None are too high, but most are high enough to make you want to hike to the top and see what's on the other side. They're high enough to present a face to the setting sun, or rising for that matter. During the golden hours of dusk and dawn, they're particularly beautiful. In the early days, this farming town grew mostly wheat, though that industry was largely declined for a multitude of reasons. The land is now mostly owned and run by giant agricultural conglomerates, and they mostly grow grass for hay to feed beef cattle on ranches a few counties over. Still, those rolling hills are a sea of green in the spring and turn a white gold in late summer before the harvest. The hills, when viewed somewhere high, are spotted here and there like an Appaloosa with little forests of trees, usually oak and maple. Little cool babbling brooks meander in and out around the bases of the hills. Scientifically, the region is known for a special species of endemic butterfly, small and blue, and beneath this sod one can still find earthworms of unusual size. This works out well because those babbling brooks are also beloved by the fly fishing community, many members of which will gladly swap out a whole box of handmade flies for a few of those whoppers. The most notable resident of Haversham is Trevor Milton. Trevor's high watermark of local fame came to him when he was a teenager, Haversham High School class of 1999. Improbably, Trevor didn't even play football. Football is king, they say, in rural America. If a teenage boy is going to become a small-town hero, he's usually a football player, usually a running back. But Haversham had never been big enough to need a large high school, and its football team was lucky during a good year if it could field both a varsity and a JV team. So nobody got too excited for the local Haversham Hawks, which was a good way to manage expectations. Trevor was one of those good kids, the overachieving kind you just tell is destined to do great things someday. You feel a little privileged to have met him in his youth. He had big dreams of being a big city journalist. His English teachers had said that he had a great natural talent for writing, and his words would just flow out onto the page like water. Trevor also had an Eagle Scout-like drive for public service. He was convinced that being a journalist would be a perfect way to use his natural writing talent to help people, to inform the public, the recording of unbiased facts, undying search for truth, and so on and so forth. Well, there was never going to be an opportunity for Trevor in Haversham. It actually had a bi-weekly paper, but it was barely more than a newsletter. It had one full-time employee, the editor, who probably should have retired years ago, and a nice lady who came in part-time to put together the classifieds. Still, when Trevor asked if they'd be interested in a voluntary unpaid intern, They didn't turn him down. He told them it was something that he could put on a college application someday, and they thought that as well. He was the sort of boy that ought to go to college, so he learned to set the classifieds and advertisements. He helped the old man proof, though not write, the obituaries. And after a while, they let him even write articles on Haversham Hawke's latest loss. Trevor had another interest, the real key to his local fame. In fact, Trevor didn't find it really all that interesting, just another useful tool that would help him be a good journalist someday. Everybody else's interest, though, was another story. Trevor was the first person in the whole town to hook his computer. Not many had computers, up to the internet. Many people in town had hardly heard of the thing and had only vague understandings of what it was or what it could do someday. And to be fair, a lot of people all over the country were like that back in the time. Unless you were there, it's hard to imagine how the whole world changed over a few short years. What really cemented Trevor's place in local law is that he created the town's first official website. Really, it was just a project Trevor wanted to do because he was bored and couldn't think of anything else, and there was nobody else to do it. He mentioned it over dinner to his parents, who mentioned it to their co-workers, and by the next Sunday, everyone in town had heard that the Milton boy had created not only his own website, but now Havsham had its own place on the World Wide Web. What a marvel. The mayor invited him over to the city hall. That was a small, almost church-like building of historical provenance, built back when the town was still hopeful of growing into something bigger. Trevor helped the mayor and the city secretary hook up their new computer to get internet access for themselves, and the first place they went was www.haversham.com. After teaching the mayor how to use a mouse and how to click the hyperlinks, Trevor was lauded for his forward thinking and great technical skills. He was going to put Haversham on the map someday. The next issue of the town's paper had a picture of him on the front page, smiling with the mayor next to a boxy CRT computer monitor. Why, the young Milton boy was so smart, the article explained. He'd built his own computer at home just by ordering the parts. Down at the church, at the post office, the barber shop, the bar, the older residents would chatter to each other about that Milton boy and a website. Oh, imagine. They'd speak out all the wwws, the dots, and the com. They didn't know what it all meant, but the fact that it was a thing now amused them, and they laughed about it. Later on, Trevor would create websites for the 3 local schools, high and junior high, elementary and primary. He'd do the same thing for the parks department, covering the 2 parks they managed. The one in the city square and the one by the creek. Later on, he'd changed the URLs to the appropriate .govs and .edus, but the pages themselves still reflect that unique mid-late 90s web aesthetic. That fall, he'd ride into the town's tiny but appreciated apple pie parade. He'd ride with the mayor in his convertible behind the high school's little marching band and ahead of the horses. Trevor had his whole future ahead of him, and he was looking for something to do. In his junior year, he found his next big project. It would be a way to tell Haversham's history to the outside world. Trevor was going to create an online registry for the dead who were buried in Haversham's little nearby cemetery. The Haversham Cemetery was a little under a half-mile west of town, obscured by one of the ubiquitous rolling hills. It was down what was now called Cemetery Drive, an unpaved road that had originally been intended to lead to other places. But by circumstances, nobody had purchased more property down the road, nor built anything down that way, so it was renamed to fit its sole surviving purpose. The cemetery was built on the southern and eastern flank of the next hill over, with its eastern edge leading down almost to the bottom, where a large swift creek ran, covered on both banks by cottonwood trees. From the air it looked like a quarter circle with the apex cut out, or, as Trevor would say, a big macaroni. The entrance by the road was on the south side, and there was a big brick memorial arch, large enough to drive a car through. The arch had been built about 100 years previously, as had the surprisingly expansive wrought iron fence that surrounded the roughly trapezoidal cemetery grounds. The graveyard had a fine view of the natural scenery. The tombstones, gates, and fencing had an additive effect on the picturesque quality of the place. Only by happenstance, no professional photographer had ever found this place. Haversham might be famous for it if they had. since nearly every resident of Haversham had at least some family member buried here. Even if it were decades ago, it was common for them to make a trip out to lay some flowers. They appreciated that their loved ones had such a pleasant spot as their final resting place. That said, burials themselves were becoming increasingly rare. The cost of burials had become impractical, and more people were choosing the more economical option of cremation. It was thought that this was all just as well. There was only so much empty space in the Havsham cemetery anyway. At some point it would be full, and that was just as well too. Trevor Milton had planned to create a website for the cemetery. The site would include the names of those buried and short biographical sketches. The people themselves, of course, were what made Havsham, and the cemetery had all gone the way back to the town's very founding. Trevor had the tiny newspaper archives to work with. There were the high school yearbooks, which went a long way back, though not all the way, and there were, of course, the elderly residents of Haversham, who'd be happy to sit with Trevor and talk about their memories. Yes, Trevor felt he had plenty of sources for his research. He could provide their names, the dates of birth, when or if they'd finished school, the jobs they'd taken, who they'd married, and who their children were. Then there was a decision that Trevor had to make concerning the cause of death. The old man at the paper had told him, secretly, that was the reason most people read obituaries for. In most cases, Trevor decided to mention the cause of death if it was known and untimely. A fatal car accident might get mentioned, but a death from old age would not. Besides, the readers could infer the latter based on the dates of birth and death. Trevor learned a lot about the town from his project. There were common surnames here that he'd see over and over. There were the Browns, the Collins, the Hertzes, the Humphreys, and the Van Dykes. They'd all been old families with children and grandchildren. He learned all about the relationships of the current townsfolk that he'd never known existed, like how the girl at school he had a crush on was a second cousin to his lab partner from chemistry class, or how the principal was the nephew of the part-time lady who did the classifieds. There had once been prominent families who'd gone extinct or moved away, like the Wilsons and the Llewellyns. Occasionally, even if rarely, new families would show up and become an integral part of the community, like the Gomez's back in the 1940s. He learned some things from the causes of death too. He'd expect to learn about men from the town who died in World War I or II, the ideas of which loomed large in his still developing knowledge of history. Instead, the town had only contributed a little over a dozen sons to the latter conflict. Only a fraction had seen combat and all survived. One had lost a leg, but he still made it home. What he did notice were two trends that surprised him. The first was infant mortality, and how high it was well into the 20th century. Before, it had only been an abstract concept to him, but when he actually catalogued the children of the residents, how many children they'd had and how many they'd lost, it really did strike him. Infant also seemed to be a misnomer to him. 6, 7, and 8-year-olds had succumbed with terrible regularity, if not quite as often as the younger ones. He found numerous cases where a female member of a given family might be born, then grow up and give birth to 8, 9, or 10 children, only to have just 3 or 4 of them survive to adulthood. Cholera, typhoid, pneumonia, tuberculosis, nondescript fevers, they'd all been a terrible scourge. He wondered about the psychology of those poor people, how they could just accept things and go on with their lives. Based on the stories in the paper's archives, they seemed as happy and content as any people today. Oh, they must have had so much baggage. This would fade with more modern medicine, only to be replaced by a new scourge in the 50s and 60s. The number of traffic accidents shocked him. While there may have been laws against drinking and driving, it was still common and overlooked. The offenders weren't made public pariahs, and seatbelts weren't standard. Airbags didn't exist yet. When he looked at some of the old photos, he noticed a lot of the roads didn't even have the white lines painted on the sides. Traffic safety might as well not have existed. Trevor had never known anybody killed in a car accident, yet for a stretch in the late 50s through the early 60s, it seemed like at least one accident a year claimed the life or lives of local high school students, not to mention other residents of Sweetleaf. Like the generations earlier, people seemed to just strangely accept the problem, as if they had no choice. and this was simply the consequence of the times they lived in. Later, the accidents would diminish, as had the diseases. As the cost of burials rose, so declined the number of burials. For the last 20 or so years, most of the buried had died of old age or the diseases that accompanied it. They'd be buried in family plots that had been purchased decades previously. It was like the graveyard itself was succumbing to its own old age. Trevor eventually ran into a roadblock going in the other direction, cataloguing the oldest of the burials. These people had died before there was any school yearbook, archived obituary, or the living memory of the oldest residents. In some cases, they had surnames and could at least be associated with known families, but in other cases they didn't. Their gravestone had been so weathered and eroded that the names were invisible, though with some parchment paper and charcoal, Trevor could sometimes rub their names back into record. By fall of his senior year, Trevor had become more socially accepted by his peers. He'd been a bit of a pariah earlier, partly because of his strange nerdy hobbies and partly because of the way the grown-ups doted on him and not them. Yet by then, they'd all become internet savvy themselves and understood its virtues, and they'd gotten to know Trevor better too. They decided he was a pretty alright guy, despite his overachieving. One Friday night, a group of his friends showed up at the newspaper office, where Trevor had been given a desk where he did most of his work. Everybody else, both of them, had left hours earlier. Trevor's friends were asking him to relax and come out and hang out with them. He agreed, but he wanted to run up to the graveyard first and make a couple of rubbings. The evening looked pleasant, but the forecast called for the beginning of autumn rain soon, and he'd rather do it dry. The friends were amiable to this idea. It wasn't like they had any particular place to go. Most small towns don't. The point was to get away from adult supervision. A few minutes later, the group of teens were strolling through the Haversham cemetery, 2 hills over from the town. Normally it'd be closed by now, and it was, but Trevor had been given a key by Jim, the man who mowed the grass here in the graveyard, also the 2 parks and the high school's playing fields. Trevor marched off straight away to the eastern uphill corner of the cemetery, where the earliest plots were, right up against the fence, to get his work over with. The others milled about, a little awestruck at how amazing the view was at dusk. Naturally, none of them had ever been to this place before. Not this late, anyway. It was while watching the ball travel through the air that they noticed the first bat. It had swooped up from the thick patch of trees at the base of the hill. Moments later, a piercing white light shone from the hilly horizon to the east. It took 2 minutes for the full pale moon to finish rising into the diminishing gap of clear sky between the cloud bank and the hills. And by then, the sky was filled with whirling and cartwheeling bats, out feasting on moths and mosquitoes. Trevor's friends had stopped throwing the ball around, partly out of concern for accidentally hitting a bat, and partly because they weren't having fun anymore. A cold wind blew from the west. It felt damp, and the air was tangibly getting ready to rain. A chill ran up their spines. It wasn't just from the cold air. Everything about their surroundings felt laden with ominous dread. None of them had ever felt anything quite like this before. They started slowly heading back out towards the entrance, where their pickup truck was parked. They looked to the north, hoping Trevor was done with his work so they could get out of this suddenly creepy cemetery. They noticed he was no longer making his rubbings and was rapidly descending the hill on the cemetery's northern border, looking like he was very busy. Trevor, for his part, had noticed the moonrise. He'd recognized that it was past time to leave and had stowed away his work in his backpack. Yet when he looked up, that is to say, looked from his backpack down to the base of the hill, his heart skipped a beat. A chill ran through his blood, and the cold wind hadn't touched him yet. Trevor saw something new that he hadn't seen before, something that probably shouldn't be. It concerned the fence. He was up the hill near the northern section, and his eyes followed the iron-wrought poles of the fence all the way down to the hill, just at the edge of the wooded creek bank, where it should have met the other section coming up from the south at a right angle. The fence almost reached the corner, but there was a break. The northern fence turned a sharp left and ran parallel to the other, then disappeared behind tall grass and the curve of the hill. Trevor descended at a good clip, a little dangerous if he hadn't been so youthful and fit. Still, the spear-like points of the eastern fence loomed up at him as he approached, and he swung his arms about for balance as he slid to a halt at the base of the cemetery. Sure enough, to his surprise, the fence lines didn't meet, and instead formed a curved passage around the hill heading north. If there had been a gate here, that would have made more sense. But it wasn't. It was simply a long continuation of the cemetery that somehow he'd never noticed before. Admittedly, he hadn't spent a whole lot of time in this one corner of the cemetery, but he still should have seen this. He took a look at the gravestone in the corner. Timothy Collins, 1919 to 1993. Sure enough, Trevor had been here before. He could remember writing up the man's description. Why hadn't he noticed the passage in the fence? The grass down the path had been mowed, presumably by Jim. Maybe he'd only mowed here recently. Maybe that path had been unmown earlier, and the tall grass had partially obscured the gap in the fencing. Trevor wondered what could be down the passage. Maybe just some maintenance area. Perhaps a tool shed where Jim had kept supplies. That almost made sense. The path was wide enough for a riding lawnmower, not a hearse, though. The grass of the path was a pale blue in the full moonlight. Perhaps that was the reason why Trevor noticed it now. The taller grass outside the fence was a darker grey. Maybe it stood out more in the moonlight. Trevor's curiosity got the better of him. He'd come to know the cemetery better than Jim, the mayor, or any of the old-timers in Haversham. It felt like it belonged to him, and he had to find out where this path led, despite him knowing that his friends wanted to leave. So Trevor walked the path. The trees to his right began to screen the moon, and only its light reflecting off the bottom of the cloud bank lit his way. But that was enough. The cottonwoods on the creek bank grew fairly straight, but they started to give way to oaks. Their large bendy limbs, heavy with moss, crossed the path over his head, a bit like giant grasping arthritic hands. If Trevor hadn't been surprised by his discovery of the path, he'd likely have been too spooked to explore. The open thick pasture just past the fence to his left buzzed with crickets, still out late for the season. To his right, in the creek, frogs were calling. He couldn't identify their species by sound, but there had to be at least 3 different kinds. They were as distinct as they were loud. Well above his head, a great horned owl hooted. It didn't startle him or make him jump. He was used to hearing the owls, and he even enjoyed them. Yet here, in this situation, it only made the goosebumps on his arm raise a little higher. The path zigged a little to the right, then back to the left, around what must have been the cemetery's hill. Then the fence to his left turned sharp, and Trevor's heart leaped into his throat. The space opening up before him was more of the cemetery, but he couldn't wrap his mind around it. Here were more gravestones, rising up a second hill. If anything, it seemed even larger than the one he'd known. The grass was even mowed, but Trevor was convinced that Jim never came here. He tried to make sense of it. The cemetery only had one big section, and yet here was a second. Trevor had known that cemeteries in the south used to be segregated, but that wasn't the case here. The town never had that sort of history or population. He was aware that many cemeteries had sections for Jewish burials, but again, the town never had a large Jewish population, and he'd have expected Stars of David on the stones. Trevor rushed up the hill to where the trees no longer cast their shadows, and there was enough moonlight to read by. He didn't recognize the names here. There were the usual patterns of family plots and more distant relations, but none of the living townsfolk shared these surnames. There were the Conyers, the Paynes, the Chapmans, the Atkinsons, the Skurlocks, the Beckers, and the Hesselings. The birth dates generally declined the further up the hill he rose, matching the pattern in other portions. In the 1940s, the 20s, the 1890s, the 1970s. Trevor paused here to catch his breath. These dates were becoming older than the stones in the previous section, and if this continued, it would soon be older than the founding of the town. Once he was ready, he resumed his ascent. It was already higher than the previous hill, and it only kept going far higher than he could have guessed at the base. The dark patches he assumed to be shrubs turned out to be trees. The pale blue rectangles that he'd earlier thought to be tombstones turned out to be whole tombs. He stopped again in front of one of them. It was large enough to hold an entire family. There was a large iron door with heavy riveted bars, keeping the dead secure. On each side were two massive vases filled with the dried remains of flowers. Both were made from what appeared to be fine marble, and so too was the tomb itself. This made no sense. This was the tomb of a wealthy family. Haversham never had any wealthy individuals, let alone wealthy families. Yet when Trevor looked at his surroundings, there were more tombs than tombstones. This looked like the sort of cemetery you'd find in a major East Coast metropolis. Oaks had been planted here, not naturally but as part of the landscaping. They towered over the tombs, and each must have been several hundred years old, from well before the town's founding. And what's more, the hill was so high this should have been viewable from the original portion of the cemetery. Hell, it should be visible from the town. Trevor's compulsion drove him up the hill once more. He paused one more time before reaching the crest. Here, gasping, he looked at the nearest stone. At the top was a crude bas relief of a skull. On either side sprouted angels' wings. The epithet read, "Here lies Prudence Goodwife, age 93, formerly lively, now dead as can be." Trevor was only a high school student, yet he knew enough about history to know this was impossible. The death's head, the rhyming couplets, the early modern puritanical name. This was the 17th century. This cemetery should not exist. Trevor moved on. When Trevor reached the top of the hill, the inescapable horror of his situation struck him like a brick. A part of the view he'd expected. Here was the usual rolling hill country, still picturesque even in the dying light. However, what was impossible was that they were all covered in tombstones, all the way off to the horizon. Tombstones and tombs, monuments and barrows, long barrows and round barrows. Trevor recognized those out of history books. Off in the distance were great mounts. There were ziggurats almost as high as the hills. There were pyramids, small, steeply sloped ones at first, and then giant squat ones off near the horizon. Then, way off in the distance, above the horizon, literally reaching up into the sky, there was... Trevor's friends had gone back to their pickup truck. There they'd waited impatiently. When they got impatient, they got back out and re-entered the cemetery, ready to drag Trevor out, kicking and screaming if they had to. They all jumped when, perhaps only 50 yards past the entrance gate, they heard the sound of rapidly approaching feet, and then the scream, "Run!" They looked up to see the black silhouette of Trevor approaching at full sprint, waving his arms wildly. Then they all took off like a shot back to the truck. They all rushed into the cab and started it up. The driver instinctively moved his foot from the brake to the pedal and floored it for a fraction of a second, sending up a great rooster tail of dust and gravel, before slamming on the brake again to give Trevor enough time to make it. Trevor didn't bother with the cab and simply leaped into the bed, smacking the roof a couple of times and yelling, "Go! Go!" The driver, with no idea of what might be chasing them, again floored it and took off down the dirt road at an inappropriate speed. The pothole-rutted road caused such a vibration at this rate that it felt like the teeth would shake right out of their skulls. When the driver checked his rearview mirror, he saw Trevor bouncing around in the bed with a toolbox and a spare tire, so he slowed just a bit until they got to the pavement, where he floored it again. They didn't stop the truck until they got back through town, drove to the other side of town, into the parking lot of the gas station convenience store that served as the primary hangout spot for meeting up with other teens their age. When they poured out of the cab, they were all laughing and in good spirits. That had been a hell of a practical joke Trevor had pulled, they told him. He'd set them up good. When he'd come running out of the darkness, hollering like a banshee, they'd really become convinced that the devil was on his heels. They all agreed it was the best practical joke pulled in some time in Haversham. When other cars with other teens pulled up, they were all eager to tell the funny story. At first, they were a little annoyed at Trevor. He was trying to keep up the bit, long after they were onto him. His face was pale. He sounded distant, like he was trying to pretend he was still scared, and that it hadn't all been a joke. Finally, he came around. He started to laugh and smile and eventually admitted that it had been a joke. He told them that they shouldn't go back there, but who would? The joke was over. Later that night, Trevor would be the first to go home, a little early. His friends guessed he just wasn't feeling that well, which explained his odd behavior. Before actually going home, Trevor returned to the graveyard, put the lock back on the chain at the entrance. He returned the next morning after daylight. It was cold and raining heavily, so nobody was likely to visit soon, not even Jim. The pathway was still here. He didn't explore it again, though. He just wanted to confirm its nightmare existence. Trevor could never account for it. His personal theory, which he never told anybody, was that the path had opened because of his project. He'd recorded the dead here, and then the dead from someplace else, well, they wanted to be recorded too. Trevor felt from deep down in his soul that that would be a very bad idea. Trevor never ended up going to college. The mayor, despite asking, had never sent off the letters of recommendation he'd written. Trevor had never even applied. It would have been difficult anyway. His grades fell off a cliff for the rest of his senior year. He was frequently truant. He even stopped hanging around with his friends. He'd never leave his parents' house. And as an adult, he would work remotely from his home, first as a web designer, then as a content creator, writing lists of inane things for popular websites. His classmates had all left town, going off to the big city, or at least bigger towns. Most of them would return to Haversham to visit their folks on the holidays. They'd find out that Trevor was still here and had never left. Oh well, they would think. That happens a lot. The kid you think is going to be a big deal when he's a teen just blossoms too early. They end up being a nobody in a backward little town, forgotten by the world. Oh, if only they'd known what a hero he really was. Trevor had taken over the groundskeeping duties from Jim when he'd retired. Now he held the only key to the lock. When the mayor retired, Trevor ran for that position unopposed. It was an unpaid position, mostly involving ceremonial things like riding in the parade and signing checks for the various city services. The residents of Haversham thought it was fitting for him. There was still a bit of civic pride left in the boy after all. His sole interest was that it would grant him the power that he needed to keep his secret hidden. He'd even hired a blacksmith a few towns over to build a few feet of wrought iron fencing based on a series of photos that he stuck at the entrance to that path to keep it hidden. Well, it's still there, of course. Trevor's the only one, though, as far as he knows, who knows of its existence. A little forgotten town, just past the main strip and down the dirt road, there's a path to the land of the dead. Some other sort of plane that wants to be a part of ours. Trevor has decided that must never happen. The dead need to stay out. That thing that reached up tall behind the horizon, that means that nobody must ever discover that path. He'd like to be able to just wipe Havsham off the map, but he hasn't got that kind of power. All he can do is hope that people forget. He has to spend his whole life, sacrifice his whole life. Well, then Trevor has decided that that's a small price to pay. So long-time listeners of the channel will know all about Mr. Kitten. He's still going strong. How old is he now? 12, 13 years old. Oof. He's getting on a bit, but he's still going strong. Good lad. He was really interested in what I was recording today and would not leave me alone. So hopefully I've managed to edit out too many of the meows from outside the door, but you might hear one or two just to let you know. Well, you already know because you've listened to the story. Yep, so a short and sweet one there for you for your Friday evening's entertainment. Back again this weekend. A lot of other stuff planned coming up. But yeah, just that story really intrigued me, so I had to do that one for you. Well, that is it for Friday evening. What are you even doing at home listening to me? You should be out there having fun, not listening to old folk like me. Okay, it was a short one, but I'm still finding a way for my brain to have been dead and waffle. Anyway, alright, time to shut up, definitely. Till the next time, my dear friends, have a good one. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. It really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams. Bye-bye.